The Nile is crossed by 9 bridges in a single city. The Yangtze, by more than 100. The Amazon, the largest river on Earth, moving close to a fifth of all the fresh water that reaches the world's oceans, is crossed by none. Not one bridge along the entire stretch that officially carries its name. The easy assumption is that it must be impossible to build one. It isn't. Engineers have drawn the plans. The funding has existed before. The real reason no bridge has ever spanned the Amazon is stranger than any engineering problem, and it begins with something most people never learn. For months at a time, this river has no fixed banks at all. They vanish under the flooded forest. The line between land and water dissolves for hundreds of kilometers, and the idea of a left shore and a right shore stops meaning anything. To understand why that single detail defeats every bridge ever proposed, you have to follow the river to a town in Peru, where a government built the longest bridge in its history, and it leads, quite literally, nowhere. Start with the scale, because the scale is the first trap your mind falls into. Stand on the bank near the city of Manaus in the dry season, and the water in front of you stretches 4, maybe 5 kilometers to the far side. That alone is wider than almost any river crossing humans have ever attempted, but that is the river at its most polite. Wait 6 months. From December to May, the rains arrive across an entire continent at once, and the water does not simply rise a little, it climbs the height of a 3-story building, and then it keeps climbing. The shoreline does not retreat by meters, it retreats by kilometers. Stretches of river that were 4 kilometers across swell to 10, to 15, in places closer to 20, and the forest itself goes under. Trees stand in water up to their crowns. Fish swim between branches that were full of birds a season earlier. Lakes that were separate merge into the main channel until you cannot say where one ends and the river begins. The patch of ground you were standing on is now somewhere beneath you, and no one can tell you exactly where, because the answer is different every week. It is hard to overstate how completely the land surrenders. Across the central Amazon, an area of forest larger than many entire countries goes underwater every single year, and then drains again, like a tide that takes 6 months to come in and 6 months to go out. The people who live there do not fight this. They raise their homes on tall wooden stilts, or on floating platforms that rise with the water, and they move their lives upward as the river climbs the walls. Children paddle to school, cattle are loaded onto boats. A village that sat on dry ground in September can be an island by March. Its streets turn to channels, its gardens lost somewhere below. To an engineer arriving with blueprints, this is not merely a difficult site, it is a site that, for half of every year, is not there. If you're new here, this is exactly what this channel was built for. Subscribe to Uncharted Depths, because in a few minutes I'm going to show you the bridge that proves the Amazon can be crossed and why the country that built it may come to regret ever trying. That vanishing ground is what makes engineers go quiet. A bridge is an argument between 2 fixed points. It has to know where the ground is, and it needs that ground to stay put. The Amazon offers neither. The towers might stand in the channel, but the long approach ramps that carry a road down to the water have to rest on the banks, and the banks are exactly what disappears. You would be building the on-ramps to your bridge on land that spends half the year several meters underwater, drowned beneath a forest that the people who live there cross by canoe, paddling between treetops where a path used to be. You cannot pour a foundation into a shoreline that vanishes. And that is before anyone has asked the harder question, the one that quietly decides everything, the one almost no one thinks to ask first. So picture the problem an engineer actually faces. Imagine you found a rare stretch where the banks did hold still. You would still have to put something underneath the towers, and this is where the river hides its second weapon. On an ordinary river, you dig down until you strike rock, and you build on the rock. Under the Amazon, there is no rock anywhere near the surface. There is mud, this is the Andes, slowly coming apart. Every year, the river drags an immense load of ground-up mountain down toward the sea, sand, silt, and clay, by some measurements more than 1 billion tons of it, and lays much of it across this enormous basin. The result is a floor of sediment so deep that in many places you could drill down further than a skyscraper is tall and still find nothing but more of the same. We know this is not a guess, because it has already been tested. When Peru built a long bridge near the city of Iquitos, across one of the Amazon's tributaries, the engineers had to drive steel piles more than 30 meters straight down just to hold up the approach roads. For the main towers, they had to go deeper still, sinking shafts as far as 60 meters into the riverbed before they reached anything solid enough to trust. 60 meters. That is the height of a 20-story building, buried out of sight, just to keep a single tower from sinking into the mud. Now imagine repeating that across a river 10 or 15 kilometers wide, with banks that wander, in a place with almost no roads to carry the steel and the concrete in. The cost stops being a number. It becomes a reason all by itself. And here is where the whole story turns over. After all of that, the moving banks, the bottomless mud, the impossible width, the main reason there is no bridge across the Amazon is none of those things. A structural engineer named Walter Kaufmann, who leads bridge design at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, was asked this exact question, and his answer was almost disappointingly plain. There is no sufficiently pressing need. That is the heart of it. The river runs for thousands of kilometers through some of the emptiest land on the planet. The banks are barely populated. There are almost no roads on either side that a bridge would even connect to. You could build the most magnificent crossing in human history, and on the far side there would be forest, and a footpath, and very little else. A bridge is not a monument. It is a link between two places people urgently need to move between. Along most of the Amazon, those two places simply are not there. And the people who do live along the water have spent generations crossing it by boat, and the boats work. So the river was never too wide to bridge. It was never too violent to bridge. It was simply never worth it. To grasp how empty this country really is, consider how people already move through it. To travel from the mouth of the river to Manaus by boat can take days, not hours, days drifting past walls of green with no town in sight for stretches longer than some nations are wide. The river itself is the highway. It always has been. Goods, passengers, fuel, medicine, all of it moves on the water, on slow boats strung with rows of hammocks, because there is no faster way, and across most of the basin, no other way at all. A bridge assumes a road on each end and a crowd waiting to use it. Here, the road is the river, and the crowd is somewhere over the horizon, which opens a strange, almost philosophical problem that has nothing to do with concrete at all. What, exactly, are we even talking about when we say, the Amazon? Because the river you picture as one clean blue line on a map does not keep a single name, or a single identity, along its length. It begins high in the Andes as something else entirely. As it flows into Brazil, the upper river is not called the Amazon. For roughly 1,000 kilometers it carries a different name, the Solimões, and it only becomes the Amazon again at one specific place. That place is just outside Manaus, where the dark, almost black water of the Rio Negro pours in from the north and meets the pale, sand-colored water of the Solimões. And the two rivers refuse to mix. They run side by side in the same channel, a hard line drawn straight down the middle of the water, near black on one side and milky brown on the other, for kilometers downstream. Because they differ in temperature, in speed, in density. Only past that meeting, where the two colors slowly bleed into one, does the river truly earn the name Amazon. So when you hear that the Amazon has no bridges, this is the precise and slightly unsettling truth sitting underneath it. Where the river is officially the Amazon, nothing crosses it. The crossings that do exist were built over its tributaries, over the rivers that feed it, before it becomes itself. Because there is a bridge. People forget this, or never knew it in the first place. In the year 2011, Brazil finished a long cable-stayed bridge near Manaus, roughly 3.5 kilometers of steel and concrete reaching across the water, its towers rising high enough for ships to pass beneath. But look closely at where it stands. It crosses the Rio Negro, the great tributary, just before that water joins the Solimões. It connects the city of Manaus to a town on the far side called Iranduba, and before it existed, the only way across was a ferry that cost around $60 and took 40 minutes, with thousands of vehicles every week lined up and waiting for their turn. The bridge cut that crossing to a few minutes. It is real, it is enormous, and engineers point to it as proof of a single quiet fact. The Amazon system can be bridged. The work is brutally hard, but it is not impossible. Brazil did it once. Which means the empty river everywhere else is not a failure of skill. It is a choice. And choices, unlike rivers, can be changed. And in one place, far upriver in Peru, that choice was made and it turned into a warning. Near the city of Iquitos, the Peruvian government built the longest bridge in the entire country, more than 2 kilometers of modern cable-stayed structure rising over a tributary of the Amazon. It was meant to be the first piece of a highway nearly 200 kilometers long, cutting through untouched rainforest all the way to the Colombian border. The bridge was finished. The towers stand. The road surface is smooth, modern, and almost completely empty. And then the project stopped. Because the highway it was supposed to begin run straight through the lands of indigenous communities who looked at what roads like it have done everywhere else in the Amazon, and refused. They have watched such roads arrive carrying not prosperity but land grabbing, deforestation, and the slow unmaking of the forest they live inside. Some who live there have said, without softening it, that the road could destroy them, so today there is a magnificent bridge standing in the Peruvian jungle that carries almost no one. It crosses a river to reach a road that was never allowed to be built. It is, in the most literal sense, a bridge to nowhere, and it is the clearest illustration of the entire paradox. The Amazon's real problem was never that we couldn't reach the other side. It was what reaching the other side would set loose. That is the moment the question stops being about engineering and becomes about something far larger than concrete and steel. Go back to Brazil, to a derelict scar cut through the forest south of Manaus. There is a road there, marked on the maps as BR 319, built in the 1970s to connect Manaus to the rest of the country by land. By the 1990s, the jungle had taken it back. Long stretches turned impassable, mud and undergrowth swallowing the asphalt until in places it nearly disappeared. And for decades since, rebuilding that road and one day, bridging the river it serves has been one of the most consequential arguments in the entire country. Philip Fernside, a biologist who has spent much of his life studying the Brazilian Amazon, has warned that reopening that single highway could open access to roughly half of the rainforest that Brazil still has left. Not half of some park or reserve, half of what remains. Because roads in the Amazon do not merely let people through. They become the spine along which the clearing spreads ranch by ranch, fire by fire, deeper into forest that nobody could reach before. The bridge, in other words, was never just a bridge. It is a door. And on the other side of that door is the carbon, the rainfall, and the staggering web of living things that the largest forest on Earth holds quietly in place. And those stakes do not stay local. The forest that such a road would open does not belong only to Brazil, or to Peru, or even to the people who live beneath its canopy. The Amazon helps generate its own weather, lifting enormous volumes of water into the air that drift across the continent and fall again as rain on farmland and cities 1,000 kilometers away. It holds a quantity of carbon so vast that releasing it would be felt in the atmosphere of the entire planet. So the modest, almost bureaucratic question of whether to build a bridge across a river quietly becomes one of the largest environmental questions on Earth, wearing the disguise of a problem about concrete and steel. So the empty river begins to look like something other than an accident. We are trained to read the absence of a bridge as a gap, a thing not yet done, a problem patiently waiting for enough money and enough ambition to arrive. But step back far enough, and the Amazon's missing bridges look less like a failure and more like a decision the world has not yet finished making. Every bridge that was never built is a stretch of forest that was never opened, a corridor of clearing that never advanced, a vast and tangled wilderness left, for now, to itself. The river that refuses to hold still, that drowns its own banks and changes its own name halfway to the sea, has managed something almost no human plan ever could. Without anyone designing it that way, it has kept the way across closed. The mightiest river on Earth has no bridge for one strange reason, not impossibility, but the absence of need. And that may be the most fragile fact of all, because need is the one thing that can appear almost overnight. A new mine, a new market, a new road waiting on the far bank, and a calculation that has held for centuries could flip inside a single generation. The Amazon is not unbridgeable, it is unbridged. And on the day that changes, the first thing to cross will not be the water. It will be everything we have decided is worth reaching on the other side. So here is the question worth sitting with after the screen goes dark. Is a bridge across the Amazon a thing the world is still missing, or a line we have simply been lucky never to cross? Subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you on Uncharted Depths.